Before you hear this story, understand one thing clearly. This is not a legend, this is not a ghost story, and this is not fiction made to scare you. This is the kind of history prefers to forget, because it involves a child who should have been allowed to grow up, but wasn't. If you enjoy dark historical stories, forgotten truths, and slow-burn mysteries that stay with you long after the video ends, subscribe to the channel now. Because stories like this don't appear often, and when they do, they disappear just as quietly. Now listen carefully. In the winter of 1894, in a mining town buried deep in the hills of Pennsylvania, age mattered more than anything else. Age decided how long you could work. Age decided whether you were fed. Age decided whether your body belonged to yourself or to the town. And yet, Samuel Reed's age slowly became something people avoided. Not because they didn't know it, but because saying it out loud felt wrong. Samuel was 11 years old. At least, that was what the church records said. But Samuel did not look 11. And more disturbingly, he did not move like an 11-year-old. Children fidget, children rush, children waste energy the way adults waste time. Samuel did none of that. He walked carefully, as if each step had consequences he could already see. He listened longer than people spoke. And when accidents happened in the mines, Samuel was never surprised. The first time someone noticed was after the North Shaft collapse. 23 men went down that morning, only 19 came back up. The town called it bad luck, but one woman remembered something else. The night before the collapse, Samuel had stood outside the boarding house, staring at the hill where the mine entrance disappeared into darkness. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. But when his mother asked why he wasn't inside, he answered quietly, "They shouldn't go down tomorrow." She slapped him for saying it. Not hard, but hard enough to teach him what kind of things children were not allowed to say. The mine collapsed anyway. And from that moment on, the town began to watch Samuel differently. The child, the mine, learned to respect. Mining towns had their own rules. You respected the mine, you respected the foreman, and you never respected fear, because fear got men killed faster than stone. Samuel did not fit into any of that. He did not fear the mine, but he avoided it. Not like a child avoiding punishment, like a man avoiding a mistake he had already seen happen. The foreman noticed him near the tracks one afternoon. Samuel was sitting on a crate, staring at the rails that led into the earth. "You waiting for someone?" the foreman asked. Samuel shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm waiting for something to pass." The foreman laughed. Nothing passed. But later that day, a runaway cart tore through the same tracks, killing a man who had been standing exactly where Samuel had been sitting hours earlier. Word spread slowly. Mining towns didn't like stories. Stories made men hesitate. But patterns were harder to ignore. Samuel was never right loudly. He never shouted, never warned crowds. He only said small things to single people, and those people lived. When survival becomes a resource. It took less than a month for the town to stop seeing Samuel as a child. They began asking him questions, quietly at first, casually. "Is today safe? Should I take the early shift?" Samuel answered fewer questions than he ignored, and when he ignored them, men died. That was not cruelty. That was math. Samuel's mother noticed the change before anyone else. Her son slept less, ate less. He flinched when asked simple things, because questions had become dangerous. One night, she found him sitting on the floor counting coal dust on his hands.
"What are you doing?" she asked. Samuel looked up slowly, trying to remember what it feels like to not know. She did not understand the sentence, but it scared her more than any answer could have. Why the town let it happen? People like to believe exploitation looks violent. It doesn't. Most of the time, it looks like gratitude. The town praised Samuel, protected him, fed him better food, and slowly they stopped letting him be wrong. Every avoided accident made his silence more expensive. Every saved life made his childhood smaller. Samuel began to age differently, not physically, internally. He learned which questions cost him sleep, which faces he could no longer look at, and which futures hurt too much to acknowledge. By 12, Samuel Reed knew something no child should ever know: that survival, when managed, becomes a system, and systems do not care who they consume.
At first, people asked Samuel. Then, without ever saying it out loud, they began to wait for him. Men would pause at the mine entrance, boots already dusty, lunch pails hanging from their hands, eyes drifting not to the foreman, but to a thin boy standing slightly apart from the group. No one told them to do it. They just did. Samuel felt it before he understood it. That heavy stillness, that moment when too many futures pressed against him at once. He stopped walking through town freely, because wherever he went, consequences followed. One afternoon, a miner named Thomas Klein bent down to Samuel's level and spoke quietly, as if sharing a secret. "Tomorrow, should I take the lower shaft?" Samuel looked at the man's hands. They were cracked, bleeding. Hands that had already given too much to the earth. Samuel hesitated. And in that hesitation, he saw it. A broken beam, a scream cut short, a body not brought back up. "No," Samuel said. Thomas nodded. The next day, another man took the lower shaft instead. He did not come back. Samuel did not attend the funeral. He stayed in his room, staring at the wall, learning something new and terrible about himself. That silence was also a choice. And sometimes, silence killed someone else instead. The weight that has no shape. Samuel began having headaches that made him nauseous. Not pain exactly, pressure, as if his mind were being stretched thinner each day. He dreamed of tunnels that never ended, of footsteps behind him that matched his pace perfectly. His mother noticed his hands shaking when he ate. "You're sick," she said. Samuel shook his head. "No," he replied. "I'm full." "Full of what?" Samuel did not answer, because there was no word for it. The town doctor examined him twice, listened to his heart, checked his eyes, declared him healthy. "Strong boy," the doctor said. Samuel almost laughed. When adults decide a child is useful. The foreman called Samuel into his office one evening. It was the first time the door had ever been closed behind him. "You're helping people," the foreman said carefully. Samuel stared at the floor. "You understand things before they happen," the man continued. "That's a gift." Samuel looked up. "No," he said softly. "It's not." The foreman sighed. "That depends on how you use it." From that day on, Samuel was given small privileges: extra bread, a warmer coat, and expectations. If he stayed quiet, men died. If he spoke, men lived. The town called it responsibility. Samuel learned the truth. It was leverage. Childhood reduced. By the time Samuel turned 12, he no longer remembered what boredom felt like, or play. Every sound meant something, every pause carried weight. Other children stopped inviting him anywhere, not because they disliked him,
because he scared them. He knew too much, and worse, he couldn't stop knowing. One night, Samuel asked his mother a question that made her sit down. If I stopped helping, would they make me? She had no answer, and that answer said everything. The collapse that changed everything. The disaster came without warning, not to the town, but to Samuel. He woke up screaming, not from fear, from certainty. He ran barefoot through the streets, knocking on doors, shouting names. People stared. Some listened, some didn't. The collapse took 7 men, less than it could have, more than Samuel could live with. That night, he understood something clearly for the first time. No matter how much he gave, it would never be enough. The choice no one expected. Samuel disappeared 3 days later. No warning, no note. They found his coat near the river and assumed the worst. But Samuel had done something no one predicted. He left the town entirely.
Samuel had imagined
he walked
the
until the
world
pressure
beyond the
thinned,
town many
until the
times.
noise faded,
In his mind,
until he could finally
it was
breathe
quieter,
without seeing
lighter.
someone else's
He
death.
was wrong. The
The
world
town
was
survived,
louder, but
poorly,
the noise was
but
different.
Samuel Reed
It did not
survived
press against his thoughts.
quietly.
It did not demand answers. It simply moved on. Samuel walked for days, slept in barns, ate when he could, and slowly, painfully, the pressure loosened its grip. For the first time in years, Samuel did not know what would happen tomorrow, and that terrified him. When knowing becomes an addiction. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It came in moments. A night where he slept without dreaming, a morning where his hands did not shake. But something else followed. Emptiness. Samuel realized that knowing had shaped him so completely that not knowing felt like loss. He missed the certainty, the clarity. He hated himself for missing it. A new name. In a small river town, Samuel stopped running. When asked his name, he hesitated. Samuel Reed, he almost said, but that name belonged to a boy who carried deaths on his back. He answered Thomas instead. The lie stuck. Growing without permission. Samuel worked small jobs, dock work, loading crates. His body grew, his face aged, but something inside him remained frozen at 11. He watched other boys laugh without calculating risk, fight without consequence. Samuel learned how to mimic normality, but never how to feel it. The dream that never left. Even years later, the dreams returned, not of minds, but of choices. Dreams where he spoke and someone lived. Dreams where he stayed silent and someone didn't. He always woke before seeing who it was. When the past finds you. Samuel thought the town had forgotten him. He was wrong again. A man recognized him at a rail station, not his face, his eyes. "You saved my brother," the man said. Samuel felt the pressure return, faint but familiar. He ran. The cost of survival. Running did not erase what he was, it only delayed it. Samuel realized something cruel and simple. The world did not need him everywhere, but somewhere it always would. Choosing who you help. Samuel stopped saving crowds, stopped trying to change systems. He helped individuals, quietly, briefly, and never twice. Old enough to understand. Years passed. Samuel became a man. He understood now what no child could, that responsibility without choice is abuse, that survival should never be transactional, and that childhood, once taken, never truly returns. The last decision. One winter night, Samuel felt it again, stronger than ever. A collapse, a crowd, many lives. He stood at the edge of a decision that would define the rest of his life.
For the first time, he chose not to look. The pressure faded. What the world never learned. History recorded the collapse, numbers, dates. It never recorded the man who could have stopped it, and never did. Samuel lived, quietly, anonymously, not as a miracle, but as proof that no child owes the world their suffering.
The letter that was never sent. Samuel bought the paper years before he ever wrote on it. It stayed folded in his coat pocket through winters, through cities, through lives that were not his own. He told himself he would know when the time was right, but time never announced itself. The letter was not an apology, nor a confession. It was an explanation, not for the town, not for history, but for the child he used to be. "You did not fail," he wrote once, then crossed it out. He stared at the ink for a long time before writing again. "You were never meant to succeed." He folded the paper back up. Some truths, he realized, did not want witnesses. The people he never let himself save. There were faces Samuel never forgot. Not the dead, the living. A woman who asked him once quietly if her son would return from the mine. Samuel had looked at the boy instead of answering. The boy smiled. Samuel said nothing. The boy returned that night, injured but alive. Samuel learned something that day, that even correct silence still hurt. The shape of guilt. Guilt did not arrive as regret. It arrived as precision. Samuel remembered details no one else did. The exact way a door sounded when it closed, the weight of a coat when it was too warm for the season. His mind cataloged moments like evidence, as if one day someone might ask him to justify his existence. Why he never married. Samuel was asked once why he never built a family. He answered honestly, "I don't trust myself with futures," he said. It was easier to walk away than to watch someone age under the shadow of his knowing. The child he almost spoke to. In a crowded city square, Samuel saw a boy standing still while everything else moved. Too still. The boy's eyes followed patterns no one else noticed. Samuel felt it, not the pressure, recognition. He almost spoke, almost warned him. Then Samuel remembered what speaking had done to him. He walked away. The difference between knowing and becoming. Samuel realized late in life that knowing was not the curse, becoming was. The moment the town began to depend on him, that was when childhood ended, not with tragedy, with expectation. Memory is a choice. Samuel stopped revisiting the mine in his thoughts. He let the tunnels collapse where they belonged. Memory, he learned, was also a form of labor, and he was done working. A quiet confession. Near the end, Samuel spoke once, only once, to a priest he did not trust. "I was a child," he said. "They treated me like a warning system." The priest said nothing. Samuel nodded. Silence, he understood, could be mercy too. The world moves on. Factories closed, towns emptied. The mine that once defined everything became a footnote. Samuel outlived it. That felt important. The last dream. In his final dream, Samuel was 11 again, not standing, playing. He woke smiling and did not wake again. What this story is really about. This was never about prediction.
It was about what adults allow themselves to take from children when fear becomes more valuable than innocence. Samuel Reed was not special because he knew. He was tragic because people listened. Why this story still matters. Somewhere, right now, a child is being asked to carry something too heavy. Not visions, expectations, responsibility, silence. And history will not record it, unless someone tells the story.
The boy sat on the wooden floor of the small rented room.
Some children grow up too fast.
Knees pulled close
Others
to his chest.
are never allowed to
The
grow
oil lamp
at all.
beside him flickered softly, casting long shadows that climbed the walls like living things. For years he had stayed quiet. For years he had watched. For years he had remembered things no child should ever remember. But that night, something broke. Outside, the wind moved slowly through the trees. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once, and then went silent. The boy lifted his head. His eyes were not afraid. They were tired. He whispered, barely loud enough for the room to hear. It's happening again. The air felt heavier, as if the past itself had returned to claim him. He stood up and walked to the small window. From there he could see the sleeping town, dark houses, empty roads, unaware of what was coming. Just like before, just like the other time. He closed his eyes, and the memories came back without permission. The mine, the screams, the sound of wood breaking, the way adults never listened until it was too late. His hands began to shake, not because he was scared, but because he knew. And this time, he was old enough to understand the cost of speaking. A knock came at the door, slow, careful. The boy froze. No one ever knocked that late. He didn't answer. The knock came again. "Son," a man's voice whispered, "are you awake?" The boy opened the door. The man standing there looked exhausted, coal dust still on his clothes, eyes red from sleepless nights. "I heard you say something about it happening again." The boy looked straight
The
at
man
him,
stood in the doorway,
and for the first
waiting.
time in his life,
Samuel studied
He
his
told
face
the
the way he
truth.
always did, slowly, carefully, measuring not fear, but intention. Adults were easy to read once you learned what to ignore. Words lied, faces did not. "You should go home," Samuel said. The man hesitated. "People are worried." Samuel nodded. "They always are." The man swallowed. "Is it true?" Samuel did not ask what he meant. He already knew. "Yes," Samuel said quietly, "but you won't like what I'm about to say." Silence stretched between them. Samuel continued, "If you act tonight, someone will die. If you wait, more will." The man's shoulders sagged, not in shock, but in relief. That relief told Samuel everything. They wanted certainty again. They wanted a child to hold it. The same pattern, older faces. By morning, the town knew. They gathered without being asked. Same faces, older bodies, same hunger behind the eyes. They stood too close, asked too quickly, watched too carefully. Samuel felt the old pressure return, lighter than before, but familiar. Where? When? How bad? He answered none of them. "I'm not doing this again," he said. The words startled even him. A murmur passed through the crowd, confusion, disbelief, offense. "You already know, so why wouldn't you help?" one man said. Samuel looked at him. "Because knowing didn't protect me," he said. "It protected you." No one answered that. They tried everything: reason, praise, fear. They reminded him of lives at risk, of families, of consequences. Samuel listened politely. Then he said, "You want me to speak, so you don't have to." A woman began to cry. Someone cursed under their breath. The truth landed heavily. Samuel stepped back. "If you want to act, act because it's right, not because I told you to." That night, decisions were made without him, and for the first time, the burden stayed where it belonged. When the mine fell anyway. The collapse came 2 days later, smaller than the last, fewer dead, but still preventable. People looked for Samuel afterward, some with anger, some with guilt, some with questions they were too afraid to ask out loud. He was gone. Not disappeared, left. The long road after. Samuel walked for days. He felt lighter with every mile, not because the world was safer, but because it was no longer using him as armor. He slept outdoors, ate little, thought less. The visions faded quickly this time. They didn't fight to stay. That scared him more than anything else. A life without warnings. Years passed. Samuel became a man no one watched closely. He worked, he moved, he aged. The future stopped announcing itself. At first he missed it, the certainty, the cruel clarity. Then he realized something important. Not knowing was freedom. What he learned too late. Samuel learned that children are not damaged by knowing too little. They are damaged by knowing too much, too early, without the power to refuse. He learned that silence can be violence, and that survival is not proof of strength. Sometimes it is proof of abandonment. Old age arrives quietly. By the time Samuel was old,
A world
the
that
world
no longer
asked
needed him.
anything of him. He
Samuel
sat near
discovered
windows,
something
watched light
unsettling
move,
after many
let
quiet
days
years.
pass unmeasured.
The world moved
No
on
one knew
easily.
who he had been.
The mines collapsed.
was the
New
point.
industries replaced
The
old
last
ones.
thought.
Towns changed names,
On his last night,
borders,
Samuel
purposes.
did not think of the mind.
No one asked
He
who
thought
had warned
of the
them
moment
before.
he said no.
No one searched for the
He
boy
understood
who once
then
knew.
that refusing
He
had
realized
not made
then
him
that
selfish.
history never
It had
holds
made
space
him
for children
human.
who survive. It only remembers children who disappear dramatically. Living quietly made him invisible, and invisibility, once frightening, became comforting. Ordinary days. Samuel lived a life made of small routines. He woke early. He worked with his hands. He returned to empty rooms. There was no urgency anymore, no pressure behind his eyes, no sense that tomorrow already existed in his mind before it arrived. At first, the absence felt like loss. Later, it felt like rest. When memories lost their power. Memories still came, but they no longer commanded him. The mine appeared sometimes in dreams, but distant, muted, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He no longer woke shaking. He no longer counted deaths. Time had done what distance began. The question he was never asked. There was one question Samuel never heard, not once in his life. What do you want to be? Children were always asked what they knew, what they felt, what they feared. But wanting required permission, and no one had ever given him that. By the time he was old enough to ask himself, the answer no longer mattered. Watching other children. Samuel sometimes watched children from afar, not with envy, with understanding. He noticed how quickly responsibility crept into their lives, how early adults praised seriousness, how often silence was mistaken for maturity. He never interfered. He knew interference invited repetition.
Aging without regret. Regret did not grow with age. It faded. Samuel realized regret feeds on alternative futures, and his life had never allowed alternatives. There had only been adaptation. You cannot regret what you were never allowed to refuse. The body slows. His body weakened before his mind did. Hands stiffened, breath shortened, steps slowed. People treated him gently now, not because they knew his story, but because age grants a kind of invisibility mixed with mercy. No one expected anything from him anymore. That was freedom. The final understanding. Near the end, Samuel reached the simplest truth of his life. What happened to him was wrong. It did not need explanation. It did not need balance. It did not need forgiveness. Wrong was enough. The last evening. On his last evening, Samuel sat alone as light faded from the room. He did not feel afraid. He felt finished. The kind of finished that comes when nothing remains unresolved, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing demanded his attention anymore. Death without drama. Samuel Reed died quietly. No witnesses, no final words, no meaning imposed. Just the end of a body that had carried too much too early. This is not a story about prophecy. It is a story about responsibility misplaced. It is about adults who chose relief over courage, about fear handed downward instead of faced, about a child who survived by becoming invisible.
Samuel
Reed was not meant to grow old, not because he could not, but because no one expected him to live once they were done with him. And yet he did. And that quiet survival is the part history never records.
He stopped correcting assumptions. When people asked about his past, he offered small truths that led nowhere. He understood that silence could now belong to him. For the first time, it was not a shield, it was rest. The towns that never knew him. Samuel moved through many towns over the years. None of them knew his history. None of them needed him to. He worked simple jobs, labor that ended when the day ended. No responsibility carried into sleep. In these towns, people spoke loudly about small problems. They argued about prices, weather, neighbors. Their worries were ordinary. Samuel listened with quiet fascination. Ordinary fear, he learned, was manageable. It did not ask for children to carry it. When fear no longer recognized him. There were moments when Samuel sensed danger approaching, old instincts stirring faintly, but the visions never fully formed. It was as if the future itself no longer expected him to watch. That realization unsettled him at first. Then it comforted him. He had been released. The life he was never offered. Sometimes Samuel imagined a version of his life that had never existed. A childhood measured in seasons instead of disasters. Mistakes allowed, ignorance protected. But these thoughts came without bitterness. They were curiosities, not regrets. You cannot mourn a life you were never invited to live. The children who would never know his name. Samuel occasionally crossed paths with children who reminded him of himself, not because they knew too much, but because they were quiet. He noticed how adults praised them, so mature, so responsible, so strong. Samuel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He never intervened, but sometimes when no one was watching, he would say a single sentence to the child. "You're allowed to be small." The child never understood what he meant. That was the point. The weight finally leaves. There came a year when Samuel realized he had not thought about the mine in months, not consciously,
not subconsciously, not at all. The absence startled him. Then he smiled. Trauma does not disappear suddenly. It loosens slowly until one day it simply fails to arrive. That day had come. Aging without witnesses. Samuel aged without ceremony. No celebrations marked his birthdays. No one tracked milestones. His body changed quietly, without commentary. Wrinkles appeared, hair thinned, strength faded. Nothing was demanded of him in return. He had become what he always needed, unremarkable. The final conversation. Late in his life, a young man once asked Samuel a casual question. "Did you ever want to be important?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "No," he said at last. "I wanted to be free." The young man laughed, not understanding. Samuel did not explain. What he finally forgave. Samuel never forgave the town, but he forgave himself. He forgave the child who spoke, the child who stayed silent, the child who ran. He forgave the fear that kept him alive. That forgiveness felt like completion. Part 70. The body ends, the story does not. When Samuel's body finally failed, there was no struggle. He had already finished living. The room was quiet. Light moved gently across the wall. Somewhere outside, life continued, unconcerned. Samuel Reed died without witnesses, and that was right. This story was never meant to be loud. It was never meant to shock. It exists to remind us of something simple and uncomfortable. Children are not solutions. Silence is not consent. Survival is not proof of strength. Samuel Reed grew old because he stepped away from fear that was never his to carry. And in doing so, he gave himself the one thing no one else ever did: a life.